Hello everyone, I'm Sarxos, and this is Victoria 2 Form Scandinavia Any percent in-game time speedrun world record explained and also world record history. Yeah, I was thinking about doing a little world record explanation video for this relatively simple category, but then I figured I might as well include some of the world record progression that has taken place over the years, to better contextualize the current world record strategies and give some spotlight to people who, aren't me. I hope you'll enjoy. Scandinavia is arguably the easiest nation to form in vanilla Victoria 2 when playing casually. This is the territory you need to either own or add to your sphere of influence in order to form it. Most of it starts under the control of Sweden, with the rest being part of Denmark. To fulfill the formation requirements, all you have to do is achieve great power status as one of these two nations and then add the other to your sphere of influence. For reasons I'll go into shortly, this is much easier to do as Sweden, so every world record ever submitted to this category has done just that. The first run submitted to the Vic2 leaderboard over on speedrun.com was performed by Zbiu YT. It was originally uploaded in early July 2020. Back then, the leaderboards only tracked real-time speedruns, which is why Zbiu included a timer in their submission video. Later on, leaderboards would expand to also include a separate subcategory for runs timed using the in-game date, and rules would be added to the real-time subcategory to ban the use of speed 5, since that speed is entirely dependent on how powerful your computer is and is thus rather unfair for competition. But since that rule didn't exist back when this run was submitted, Zbiu made liberal use of speed 5 throughout, which would unfortunately retroactively invalidate the run for the real-time subcategory after the later rule change. However, the game speed doesn't matter for runs timed by the in-game date, so this run is still considered valid for that subcategory and is thus the first official IGT world record in the Form Scandinavia category. The run didn't look too different from what you expect of a casual Scandinavia playthrough, but it nicely showcased precisely why Sweden is the preferable choice over Denmark. Sweden starts the game at rank 9, just one rank below the Great Power threshold. They can't improve their military or industrial score very much at the start, but they have all the more ways to accumulate prestige. For starters, their incredibly high starting literacy of 80% lets them research new technologies very quickly. Zbiu made use of this to rush their romanticism and realism technologies, both of which increase prestige gain and contain inventions that may grant large one-time bonuses to prestige. Throughout the run, Zbiu also received several of the unique events Sweden has access to, many of which grant additional prestige bonuses. Finally, there's the decision Abandon Finland, which removes all Swedish cores from Russian-controlled Finland, but in return Sweden receives yet another boost to their prestige. All this combined allows Zbiu to achieve great power status on November 2nd, 1839, and then they just had to influence Denmark at full throttle until they could add them to their sphere. The only remaining obstacle at this point was Prussia, who has significant influence in Denmark right from the start, and ended up using said influence to expel Sweden's diplomats at one point, which effectively wasted a little over 50 influence that Zbiu had invested up to that point. Fortunately, after that one action, Prussia would not interfere anymore, allowing Zbiu to eventually add Denmark to the sphere and finish the run on April 18, 1841. At the time this run was performed, the series of actions taken during it was seen as the definitive strategy to forming Scandinavia and was already fairly well established as the go-to strategy for casual playthroughs as well, due to the fact that it's very simple to execute once you know how. The only real addition to the base strategy that Zbiu used to speed things up was to invest into some private construction projects in a bid to increase their industry score, but it's unlikely that made much difference in this case. During the later parts of that same month, shortly after the leaderboard had been reworked to allow IGT runs and ban speed 5 in RTA runs, several more people would submit runs to the Scandinavia category. These included runs by Motbeans, Speedy D Frog, and myself, and they were all submitted first and foremost as real-time runs in the new RTA No Speed 5 subcategory. These runs used the same basic strategy as the one used by Zbiu, but a few minor optimizations were gradually added. To gain great power status faster, Tricks like encouraging craftsmen to maximize industry score and building man-o'-wars to gain some extra military score were utilized. But the main improvements lay in increasing the influence rate in Denmark after becoming a GP. Improving relations with Denmark to its maximum of 200 helped a bit, as did researching the market structure technology for 10% extra diplomatic influence. Then there's the matter of foreign investment. Contrary to what many people believe, investing into another country doesn't directly increase your influence gain in it. Rather, it decreases the influence gain of every other great power. But the amount by which it is decreased is proportional to the amount of money you have invested versus the amount invested by other countries. In other words, if a second great power has already invested into the country, then the more you invest into that same country, the less influence penalty you will have, which indirectly increases your influence gain rate. As it happens, the United Kingdom starts the game with exactly £2,000 invested into Denmark, slapping you with a full minus 50% influence penalty by default. By investing into Denmark yourself, you can easily reduce that penalty down to just a few percent, so that was incorporated into the speedrun too. But aside from these smaller optimizations, the differences in end times mostly came down to RNG with prestige generating events and inventions, as every runner used essentially the same strategy. Except for Mudbeans, who just went balls to the walls and declared war on Denmark as soon as they could to conquer Schleswig. This didn't seem to benefit their rise to great power though, as they still didn't achieve that until February 1841, and it was actually actively detrimental in the long run, since it gave them a truce with Denmark until January 1842, preventing them from influencing them until that date. So it didn't really work out in their favor, but it's just such a ballsy move that I can't help but respect it. And either way, they did come out of this with the first official RTA NS5 record, with a time of 24 minutes and 34 seconds. Mudbean's run does pose an interesting question though. While a conquest war goal might not be all that helpful, perhaps declaring war on Denmark with some other war goal could be a viable strategy. After all, diplomatic influence is only one way to add someone to your sphere. The other method is through the Add to Sphere war goal, which becomes available once you reach great power status. Unfortunately, there's one major obstacle to this approach. Prussia starts the game at friendly opinion in Denmark, which means they are able to intervene on Denmark's behalf in case they are attacked. Mudbeans actually got really lucky in the run that Prussia had already gotten themselves into another big war at the same time, which is pretty much the only thing that will stop an AI great power from intervening in every war that they're able to. But in the vast majority of games, trying to sphere Denmark for war within the first couple of years of the game is almost guaranteed to bring Prussia down upon you, and even if you were able to eventually win that war, it would definitely be too slow for a speedrun. So sadly, war with Denmark is pretty much out of the question. But that doesn't mean that wars can't be helpful in general. You see, the biggest issue with the Scandinavia speedrun up to this point was that, despite incorporating what little optimizations could be found, the most important factor for getting a good time was still the RNG related to prestige events and inventions. But on July 27, I would rectify this by introducing a new, much more proactive strategy. Right at the start of the run, I loaded my armies onto ships and sailed them over to North Africa, where I declared war on Morocco for the cut down to size war goal, and then proceeded to do the same thing to neighboring Algeria. The purpose of this was quite simply to farm prestige, as cut down to size grants 10 prestige when it's enforced. In terms of prestige to infamy ratio, the humiliate war goal is a lot more efficient, but I had concluded that the 5 prestige gained from humiliate would not be enough, and since this was right in the beginning of the run, I could easily restart until I got decent luck with infamy from my war justifications. But by the time I got to my third war target, Tunis, my infamy was too high for yet another cut down to size, and so I settled for a humiliate against them. In total, these wars earned me no less than 25 prestige, which reduced my reliance on prestige from events and eliminated the need to research realism after romanticism, enabling me to go for market structure as my second technology instead of third. This helped me become a great power by November 3rd, 1839, and after adding Denmark to my sphere, I was able to close out the run with a final in-game time of October 19, 1840. A few months later, in early 2021, my record was beaten by a runner named Treadwell. They mostly copied my strategy, except that instead of fighting 2 cut-down-to-size wars against Morocco and Algeria and 1 humiliate war against Tunis, Treadwell settled for just humiliate wars against the former 2 and left Tunis alone altogether. Despite earning only 10 prestige total from this, compared to the 25 I earned in my run, Treadwell still managed to become a great power as early as May 1839, and finished the run by forming Scandinavia on April 27, 1840. This was thanks to having considerably better luck with prestige from events and inventions, which goes to show that although the North Africa strategy may reduce the reliance on RNG, it doesn't eliminate it completely. This did not sit well with me, so a few months later I set myself the challenge of finding a reliable strategy that would be so fast as to render the prestige RNG firmly irrelevant. The problem with the North Africa strategy was that, while it offered a reliable source of prestige, fighting 3 consecutive wars against 3 middle-sized countries simply took too much time. But what if I told you there's a way to gain the same amount of prestige but from a single war against a much smaller country? Welcome to the Haiti Strat. As I alluded to before, the Humiliate war goal is one of the most efficient war goals in terms of infamy, granting 5 prestige for just 3 infamy. But one which is even more efficient is Dismantle Fortifications, which costs 4 infamy but gives a whole 10 prestige. On top of that, it only costs 10 war score to enforce, so it's one of the cheapest war goals in that respect too. Only problem is, this war goal is only available against countries that actually have some fortifications to dismantle. Both forts and naval bases count for this, but right at the start of the game, most countries that fulfill this criteria are either major powers or are sphered by major powers. One of the few exceptions to this is Haiti, making them a more attractive target than the North African countries. As such, on the 26th of April 2021, I started my speedrun by justifying first a cut down to size and then a dismantle fortifications war goal against Haiti, loaded an army onto some ships and sent it toward the Caribbean. Once there, I had them make landfall and begin occupying parts of the island. My initial war goal was the cut down to size one, but the second one I added was actually a plain old humiliate, which I had not bothered to justify in advance. And then finally I added the dismantle fortifications on top of everything. Adding war goals you haven't justified before the war requires jingoism. But Sweden gets a pretty good amount of jingoism thanks to the revanchism they get from their cores in Finland. In this run I still opted to justify 2 war goals ahead of time, because I needed to spend a few months in the beginning to build more transport ships anyway. Due to how much smaller and weaker Haiti is compared to the North African countries, the war can be finished in a fraction of the time and still yield a total of 25 prestige. This combined with the 10 prestige from abandoning Finland let me reach above rank 8 as early as July 1837, and then become a great power 1 year later in July 1838. The final in-game time for the run ended up being the 22nd of June 1839. With that, a strategy had finally been found that would definitely be faster than what the prestige events could manage on their own. It might seem kinda cruel against poor Haiti, but honestly, Imperialist powers bullying Haiti for their own gain is pretty par for the course if you look at real history. The Haiti Strat ended up being the longest reigning strat in this category's history so far, as several more runs will be submitted using variations of it over the coming years. On the IGT side, my time would be beaten in August that same year by a runner appropriately named August 17. They put their own spin on my strategy by not bothering to build any additional transports at start, which meant they could only send 3 regiments to Haiti instead of the 7 or 8 that I sent in my run. But that allowed them to arrive sooner and start the war after justifying only 1 war goal, while adding the other 2 later using jingoism. In the end, this approach didn't necessarily save any time over mine, however, as the time they saved on starting the war sooner, they later lost when their smaller army couldn't finish the war as quickly. But they still managed to beat my time by about 3 in-game months, thanks to taking the abandoned Finland decision sooner. This decision still adds a bit of RNG to the run, since it can only be taken if your country has at least 4 consciousness, but less than 45 prestige. For the Haiti Strat to work, it's important to get the required consciousness before you end the war with Haiti, as otherwise you'll most likely exceed the 45 prestige threshold and lock yourself out of the decision altogether. In my run, I didn't get the required consciousness until a few months after Haiti was ready to accept peace, but August was a bit luckier and could abandon Finland before they had finished with the war, and thus it wasted them no time. To be honest, this decision probably wasn't strictly required for these runs, but by taking it you gave yourself a bit more leeway with your prestige in case of bad luck later on, so it was still nice to have it. Meanwhile on the RTA side, I will go on to set a new world record with the Haiti strategy as well, clocking in at 11 minutes and 45 seconds, an improvement of nearly 13 minutes over the old record. This record, along with August's IGT record, would continue to stand unbeaten for about 2 years. But then, another new runner made her debut in the category, and immediately snagged both world records with a single speedrun. This runner was Random Map Boy, who submitted a run which simultaneously beat the IGT record by 6 in-game days and the RTA record by over a minute. They achieved this through the cleanest execution of the Haiti Strat to date. First, they opted to follow my approach to the Haiti War by taking the time to build more transports, so they could evade the island with a larger force and manage to win that war faster than anyone had done before, receiving a peace deal from Haiti as early as February 1837. But then they had to wait a bit longer before they could abandon Finland, so they couldn't actually end the war until April, which also meant they didn't reach great power status until April the following year. At this point they were already well ahead of the RTA record, but were actually about 20 days behind the IGT one. But by the time the run ended, they had managed to close that gap and even overtake the old record, owing mostly to the fact that Random Map Boy invested far more heavily into Denmark's industries than August had done, so they had a considerably lower penalty to the influence gain. When all was said and done, Random Map Boy had achieved a new IGT world record of March 17, 1839, and a new RTA world record of 10 minutes and 38 seconds. Breaking 2 records with a single run, that's certainly an impressive feat. Random Map Boy's 2 records would then remain at the top for well over a year. While the Haiti Strat might still have some room for improvement, it had already been optimized to the point that RNG would once again play a deciding role for claiming the record, and it didn't seem like anyone was willing to grind that out. Eventually though, there was another improvement to the category, but it didn't happen through the Haiti Strat. Rather, it came about via yet another new strategy. And I'm happy to announce that, for once, I was not the one to come up with it. Rather, that honor goes to the runner El Pro 4, and the strategy they came up with is quite ingenious. Like with the previous few strategies for this category, El Pro started the run by justifying a war goal, but this time it wasn't a humiliate or cut down to size or even a dismantle fortifications. No, this time it was a straight up conquest war goal, and the target was Lübeck. Now right away this looks like a crazy move, not only because conquest is the most expensive war goal in the whole game with its 22 infamy, but also because Lübeck is part of Prussia's sphere of influence, so they will certainly be called in on Lübeck's side. But the fun doesn't stop there, as El Pro followed up the first war justification with a second one targeting Hamburg, another Prussian sphereling, but this time it was just to dismantle fortifications. Shortly before the second justification would finish, El Pro declared war on Lübeck and invaded them by the sea. It didn't take long to fully occupy them, and once that was done, El Pro added a dismantled fortifications on them as well for good measure. They then waited for the war justification on Hamburg to finish and declared war on them too. Now, this is certainly a very bold set of opening moves, but how on earth are they going to come out of this on top? They may have been able to overrun Lübeck before Prussia had time to interfere, but there's no way they could win the war against Prussia long term, and even if they could, it would definitely take too long for a speedrun. But here's where the brilliance of this strategy starts to reveal itself. Normally, when a great power answers a call to arms and becomes the war leader, you can't sign any separate peace deals with your ally so long as you've only added war goals on the ally and not the war leader. But as it happens, any war goal that results in a full annexation of the ally, such as the Conquest war goal, is an exception to this rule. These war goals allow you to make separate peace to annex the ally without ending the war with the war leader, because the game automatically adds a free people war goal on the war leader side to release the ally again. And while you enforce a conquest war goal, you can also enforce any other war goals you have on that country, so long as the total war score doesn't exceed 100. The conquest war goal itself only costs 85, so it's possible to squeeze in a dismantle fortifications for 10 war score too. As a result, after occupying Lubeck, El Pro was able to make separate peace with them, and the 2 war goals they enforced gave them a combined 20 prestige for their troubles. Meanwhile, since they declared a war on Hamburg while they were already at war with Prussia, Prussia was unable to join that war at all, so Hamburg was left all on their own and was willing to surrender after a simple blockade of their port. That just left El Pro to deal with Prussia themselves, but they could immediately get out of that by accepting Prussia's demand to release Lubeck again. This might seem like a plus-minus-0 situation, but in fact, surrendering to a free people war goal only costs you 2 prestige, so actually this was a 30-2 situation. In other words, the whole ordeal left El Pro with a net gain of 28 prestige, and could thus jump up to above rank 8 in April 1837. So that's cool and all, but if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that this strat doesn't actually let you reach rank 8 any faster than the old Haiti Strat. That's because, although your targets are much closer and quicker to defeat than Haiti, the Conquest war goal takes about twice as long to justify as most other war goals, so it's generally not possible to start these North German wars as early as you could versus Haiti. But if it doesn't save any time, then what's the point? Well, that starts to become clear when we look at what El Pro did after becoming a great power. They justified an out-of-sphere war goal on Denmark and forced them into their sphere of influence by force, which ended up being much faster than taking the diplomatic route. But we already talked about this earlier in the video. If you declare war on Denmark, Prussia is bound to intervene against you, which is why that approach isn't supposed to be viable. However, in this case, there's one mechanic that changes everything. Great powers can't intervene in a war against someone they have a truce with. And what did El Pro get after finishing all their earlier wars? That's right, a truce with Prussia. So they were free to fight Denmark as much as they liked without fear of a Prussian intervention. And that right there is the real reason why this strategy is superior to the Haiti one. Thanks to all the time saved by sphering Denmark through war rather than through diplomacy, El Pro managed to beat the IGT world record with a time of December 27, 1838, the first ever sub-3 year time. However, this new world record happened to come in right around the time that I had returned to streaming Victoria 2 after a 16-month hiatus, and when I saw it I was immediately inspired to try my hand at it myself. It was genuinely exciting to witness a strategy that I would never have thought of myself, but I quickly saw one notable part of it that could be improved. I started my run by more or less copying El Pro's strategy, except I took care to restart the run several times in the beginning until I got decent luck with my infamy from the justification of the Conquest war goal on Lübeck. Once I got an amount I was happy with, I executed the wars against Lübeck and Hamburg as normal, and then made peace with Prussia, just as the previous world record had done. But then came the point where I introduced my own innovation. Rather than waiting to become a great power before justifying war on Denmark, I began justifying it immediately after finishing with the North Germans, and then declared the war as soon as I was able. Of course, since I was still a secondary power at that point, the out-of-sphere war goal wasn't available, so I went with a simple humiliate instead. I overran Denmark's measly defenses and fully occupied their home territory. Then I just sat back and waited until I became a great power. With that, the out-of-sphere war goal was finally made available to me, so I promptly added it using Ingoism, and since I had already essentially fully defeated Denmark, they were willing to accept peace right away. This approach saved a big chunk of time over El Pro's original strat, because I got both the war justification of Denmark and the war itself done while waiting to become a great power, while the previous record had to dedicate additional time to those things at the end of the run. In the end, I had beaten the world record with a time of September 28, 1838. This strategy effectively did away with the last real prestige-related RNG of the run, namely the decision abandon Finland, because although the 10 prestige it granted could be a nice bonus, it also removes all your revanchism along with your course on Finland. Without said revanchism, it's pretty much impossible to build up enough jingoism during the war with Denmark to add the sphere war goal, so the decision had to be ignored. It did introduce a new RNG element though. You have to make sure not to get too much infamy from the first war justification on Lübeck, since all the war goals you have to add during the run could easily push you above the limit otherwise. But since it's right at the beginning of the run, it's not too painful to simply restart until it turns out in your favor. After achieving this record, I was quite happy. I posted the run to my second YouTube channel and even shared it on Reddit and everything, proudly boasting that I once again held the world record for the Scandinavia speedrun. And literally the day after I did all that, El Pro returned and took the record back again. Oh well, I guess I didn't leave them much time to relish their previous record either, so I have no right to complain. In this new speedrun, El Pro incorporated the new strat regarding Denmark that I had used, which meant our runs followed essentially identical routes. Despite this, El Pro's final time ended up being the 3rd of May 1838, nearly 5 in-game months faster than my run. How is that even possible? Well, I have been talking a lot about how all the new strategies that were introduced throughout this category's history gradually reduced the amount of RNG, to the point where you would no longer need any RNG-based events or inventions to get the required prestige for great power status. But there is one other RNG element that I have neglected to mention up to this point for the sake of brevity, but I'm gonna have to mention it now, and it's probably the most frustrating RNG element of the whole run, due to how utterly powerless you are to affect it. Let me introduce you to Spain and the Ottomans, the two great powers that start the game at nation rank 6 and 7 respectively. Due to the fact that the initial rank 8 nation USA always pulls ahead of these two shortly after the game starts, it will always be one of them that you will have to push out of the Great Power Club in order to take your spot there as Sweden. When explaining the mechanics of becoming a great power, people will usually say that you first need to reach rank 8 or above and then remain at that rank for exactly 1 year, at which point you will become a great power. But that's not entirely accurate. Rather, what you actually need to do is reach rank 8 or above while pushing one of the existing great powers below rank 8, and then make sure that they remain at that rank for a year in order for them to lose great power status, which will then instantly free up a spot for your nation to claim. In most cases, this distinction doesn't really matter, as obtaining and holding rank 8 for a year is often the same thing as pushing an existing great power below rank 8 for a year. But if there are 2 or more existing great powers that are very close to each other in nation score, then it's possible that you might skip past both of them straight to rank 7, while those 2 are left to fight over the rank 8 spot. And every time that one of them managed to overtake the other, even for a single day, the 1 year to drop from great power timer is reset. Thus, if you're unlucky, you might have to wait much longer than 1 year before you become a GP. This scenario happens to be very common for Spain and the Ottomans in the first few years of the game, which means you must not only worry about staying ahead of them yourself, but also worry about one of them staying ahead of the other. In my last world record for this category, I had actually initially achieved the top 8 rank on the 16th of April 1837, the exact same day that El Pro did it in their new world record. But I then had to watch helplessly as Spain and the Ottomans traded the rank 8 spot between themselves a few times, which meant I couldn't become a great power until August 30, 1838, 4.5 months later than optimal. El Pro meanwhile had fortune on their side, as they became a great power on April 16, 1838, which is exactly on schedule. They then gained yet another 2 days on me as I waited 3 in-game days before adding my sphere war goal on Denmark due to not pausing the game fast enough, while El Pro only wasted 1. This allowed them to finish the run a whole 4 months and 15 days ahead of my record. Nonetheless, they beat my record fair and square, so I'm only a little bit salty. At least I could later make use of the strategy to reclaim the RTA record with a time of 9 minutes and 11 seconds. The execution wasn't perfect, and the RNG was pretty close to what I got in my IGT run, so the time could have been a lot better. But the new strategy is just inherently so much faster than the old one that even an imperfect run managed to beat the old record by almost a minute and a half. And that's where the record still stands today. As L-Pro already got nearly perfect RNG and had a very clean execution, there isn't much more time that can be saved on the IGT side of things. Of course, that's assuming there aren't some further improvements that can be made to the strategy itself. I actually have been theory crafting some strategies that might be faster, but they would be so ridiculously RNG dependent that I'm not sure I want to attempt them anytime soon. The RTA record still has a lot of room for improvement though, so anyone who feels like giving that one a go is free to do so. Alright, that is all. I hope you enjoyed this little world record history. I might consider doing similar record progression videos for some of the other categories on the leaderboard, if people are interested. Although most of them haven't had as much variation in strategies as the Scandinavia one. Either way, let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in that. But for now, have a splendid time of day.